Pilot's flight crews of Reddit. What went wrong on your flight that the passengers never knew about? Cockroach in the cockpit. Red eye from lax. One of us was strapped in while the other one hunted for the little ducker. My dad had a wasp in the cockpit with him once. He said his first thought when he noticed it right after taking off was, oh, so this is how I die. It was a flight from Kansas to Oregon, and as we were mid-flight, a hawk ducking dive bombed the wing and dented it. The pilot announced the subtle thud as minor turbulence, but the crew knew what had happened. No one knew how the hell the hawk was flying so high. It was a smaller plane, so we only had 1.5 dozen people, not counting us crew members. The dent didn't actually mess with flight too much, but it's a hell of a story to tell. As a kid, 8-9, I flew in a small plane with my Air Force dad and his friend. We lived in Minot, ND, big base there, and were flying sometime in winter. Later I learned we had such a long joy flight that day because the landing gear froze up, and we were flying around trying to get them to come down. As we were almost out of fuel they were planning to crash land on the frozen river, when in the nick of time the landing gear unfroze and deployed. I had no idea though. It was beautiful flying above a winter wonderland. I was giving my sister and a friend a tour of the Chicago skyline over Lake Michigan. We are all having a good time. Suddenly, the engine goes quiet. A nightmare, especially because I only have one of them. The silence was noticeable and my sister looks at me and starts to panic. The engine comes back within about 3 seconds alive and well, and I head for the nearest airport. In a small propeller plane, it is hard to hide the silence of the engine, but since it came back, I acted like nothing happened. I don't think they realize how critical of a situation it almost was. It breaks all the time. Normally nothing so bad that the plane is gonna crash, but important enough that we take some sort of corrective action. The systems in planes, I fly a corporate jet, are so redundant and interconnected that you don't always know for sure what's actually broke. Example, you might get a message saying that your ground spoilers failed but you can look back and see that they're working just fine. Turns out it's just a sensor gone bad. But do you think I flew the plane again until that sensor got fixed? Hell no. So to answer the question, they almost never know. Edit. They don't know until they get the maintenance bill. Edit number 2. My highest rated comment, and it's probably because someone read it while on the toilet. I was flying a Piper Navajo that seats 8 passengers out of a small airport. We were making all of our required radio calls. But because this was a small uncontrolled airport, some people in small airplanes will operate without radios or just don't care enough to broadcast their position. Anyway, we were doing our due diligence, but not long after takeoff and while leaving the traffic pattern, my FO says it and takes control from me and make a relatively aggressive, for passengers at least, turn to the right. As he does this, I see a Cessna out my left window no more than 150 feet below us. We essentially climbed through the altitude he was cruising at and turned to avoid him. Only one passenger noticed when we got to the destination and he told us it was a good move. Good times. My dad used to fly cable patrols in a Navajo, dropping leaflets on trawling vessels in the vicinity of subsea cables. Much of the time they'd be cruising low below the ceilings and sometimes even below 100-200 feet. Occasionally a band of low cloud or fog would appear and they would just pass through it rather than maneuver in instrument conditions and then have to relocate the cable. Once dad told of passing through a band of low cloud and coming out the other side to see an iceberg less than 2 miles ahead and stretching above the altitude they were flying at. Said he was never really comfortable doing cable patrols on cloudy days after that. What on earth is this mountain goat doing up here in the clouds? Landed on the wrong runway. It was nighttime, and Tower didn't inform me of my misjudgment until less than 1/4 mile away. I was a young private pilot and had a few passengers, so it wasn't too big of a deal. Not a pilot but used to do work on one's house. My favorite story was the time the heater went out in the cockpit but not in the rest of the plane. So the pilot and crew are up there freezing, putting all their clothes on trying to warm up. Instruments and whatnot are freezing up. They had no idea if they were going to be able to land. I was flying 2 of my friends back from some tasty barbecue in Georgia a few years back. As we got closer to home, the weather really started to get bad. A lot of pop-up storm cells. It was a perfect situation for my iPad, used for navigation charts, to totally die, as well as my onboard weather radar. I was internally panicking, and air traffic control was my saving grace and helped me get home safe. A few months later my friends asked this same question. They said I looked so calm, so they figured it was no big deal. Not a pilot, but one of my buddies is. We were talking about one of the more remote airports that we'd both visited, located in a difficult place that has a lot of wind shear, so passengers are used to having the plane make a couple of attempts when landing. Anyway, my friend said the sensors for the landing gear malfunctioned, so he couldn't tell whether the wheels were down or if they'd gotten stuck. He flew low, made an announcement to the cabin that they needed to circle the runway because of the wind, and made a call to the control tower asking for someone to make a visual confirmation that the landing gear was fully deployed. As a child, my family and I spent a few days in the Bahamas, and as we were at the outdoor airport single runway we discovered that we were flying an 8-seater single prop plane back to Florida. The first time taxiing down the runway, the pilots discovered something was wrong with the engine, so they pulled off to the side and made us sit next to the plane as they attempted to fix the engine. After being told that the plane was functioning again, we boarded and began to taxi down the runway again. I was watching the pilot and company pilot do their thing when I noticed the airspeed indicator drop to 0 as we were about to lift off. At this point we were running out of runway, and I watched as the co-pilot jabbed the non-working gauge with his palm and the gauge began to work again. The pilots then looked at each other, back at us, then back at each other before laughing. I wasn't the crew on either, but my service had 2 pretty severe bird strikes within several weeks of each other. One was a hawk of some kind and the second was a duck. The duck strike happened with a patient loaded, evidently just as the pilot was flipping his NVGs up. The duck came through the windscreen and went to smithereens along with all the plexiglass. I helped clean up the back of the helicopter later, and it looked like a duck had swallowed a duck of lit dynamite. The strike also happened at the exact moment the med crew had pushed a medication that relaxes all the muscles in the patient's body, including breathing muscles. And in spite of the chaos they continued their procedure and successfully controlled the patient's airway. The pilot also continued the flight in spite of being covered in duck blood, guts, feathers, as well as his own blood from his broken nose. The crew, and the other bird strike crew, received commendations for their calm composure under the circumstances. It's pretty mind-boggling the damage a several-pound bird can inflict. Disclaimer: don't read this before taking a plane. This thread should know there's a small, dead subreddit called Our Tales from Flight Desk that could benefit from these stories. That site is great to see incidents happening around the world. My favorites are the bird strikes and landing gear failures, if there are pictures. A colleague of mine was flying with a captain who couldn't stop giggling since he got on board his 737. Only when they were cruising that the captain took out a yellow live baby duck from his flight bag. Couldn't believe the story, but the dude recorded a video of a little duck chilling in the sun on top of a mode control panel. Photo. My friend's girlfriend is a flight attendant and she told us about a flight she had during the spring break season where a large group of frat sorority people basically drank all the alcohol that was on the flight and they had to keep that from the passengers. After hearing about it we made her watch the Wade Boggs episode of It's Always Sunny. I was on a commercial flight, not a pilot, and the woman next to me was talking about how you rarely see other aircraft when looking out the window. So I explained that it's a big sky, etc. As we're coming in to land, she looks out and goes, "Oh, look, there's a plane." So I lean forward to look out the window and there is a C-130 coming right at us. Not like it close, but close enough that I can identify it. And then our aircraft descends and flies quite low over the suburbs of whatever city I was connecting in that day. We land, and as we taxi I see that there is an Air National Guard C-130 unit based there. We walk off and the crew is saying goodbye. I look at one of the pilots and go, "So, how about that C-130? Rapid change of his facial expression. Not a pilot or flight crew, but once as a passenger on a Lufthansa transatlantic flight to Frankfurt on a 747-400. On landing I saw a whole bunch of fire engines and emergency vehicles surrounding the runway as we were landing. Now this runway in Frankfurt has some glass-walled buildings next to the runway. In the reflection of those buildings I could see all those fire engines and emergency vehicles were following my aircraft. For at least 30 seconds till the aircraft came to a stop I had this sickening feeling in my stomach. But once the aircraft came to a stop on the runway, after a brief pause we started normally taxiing to the gate, just like any other flight would. On deboarding I could see the aircraft was still surrounded by 4 fire engines. Never knew what really happened. I later found out that aircraft was retired by Lufthansa a few months after I took the flight. I've had medicals on board where we're dealing with them in the galley, going to get the oxygen, and other passengers will stop me to ask me how long it'll take for their food to be cooked because apparently they've been waiting ages. I'm not a pilot, but flying into Vegas one time the whole plane rotated counterclockwise about 40 degrees while we were in landing approach. The captain immediately went full throttle, aborted the landing, and came around for another pass. He chuckled, haha, little wind shear there. Folks, sorry about that into the intercom, but I'm pretty damn sure he'd just saved all of our lives. I peeked in the cabin to thank him as we disembarked, and he looked like he'd seen a ghost and lived to tell the tale. Not flight deck, but I work in civil aviation. It's really not uncommon for planes to leak fuel when the engines first start, especially on cold days. Loading errors are common but rarely serious. Sometimes part of the aircraft is missing and it will only fly at the engineer's discretion. Sometimes in that situation, the aircraft will continue to fly for a surprising amount of time before repair. Seeing these kinds of errors and malfunctions on a daily basis makes me feel safer flying though. None of what I have seen has ended in fatality. Anybody who has ever flown into Juba, South Sudan likely has a few stories to tell. Imagine an airport where there is one frequency with one guy manning it. This person is at us. Clearance delivery, ground, tower, and area control. And the airport is as busy as hell. The only way to describe the radio work is complete anarchy, with everyone stepping on each other. You can easily go 10-15 minutes without getting a radio call in. Needless to say TCAS are commonplace. Airmanship is abandoned. There's pedestrians on the taxiways and guys zooming all over the place with trucks and motorbikes. The taxiways are so congested with parked aircraft you must taxi on the shoulder, straddling the taxi lights that do not work. Sometimes tower will clear 6 or 7 aircrafts to enter the runway at once to let them all take off one after the other. It's really a special place, and a lot of it happens every day that the passengers have no clue about. If you ever get a chance to fly in Africa on a UN, WFP, ICRC, MAF, etc contract, I would definitely recommend it. Dad's a pilot, so I get to hear all of these. Good one that comes to mind you. He flies 737s for a major airline, getting ready to take off at night. He sees a plane about to land on the taxiway he's waiting on. He immediately just starts turning on every exterior light on the plane. Other plane pulled out of final descent at like 500 feet. Just talked to him on the phone about it. He said it was back when he was flying the 727, so about 15 years ago now. He remembers seeing the plane coming down, and the captain was looking back over his shoulder at another plane. So my dad starts throwing on all of the lights, at which point the captain turns around and starts asking him what he's doing, and sees the plane, and then both of them literally just duck, wait for something to happen, and after a couple of seconds, when it's clear the plane wasn't going to hit, they both sit up, and my dad starts trying to call the tower. The tower is just not responding at all for a bit, and then a lady comes on. The dispatcher had been a man, and basically says, when you get to your destination, call this number, and the dispatcher and the pilot of the other plane both lost their licenses. I'm a bush pilot in Canada. I was working the right seat of a turbo otter, my first ever flight in one, so I was still getting used to the setup. We were taking off from a short strip in the middle of nowhere with 6 drillers in the back and a bunch of gear. Captain started the engine as I was just finishing up the passenger briefing. He started rolling down the runway as I was just getting seated. I thought he was just positioning the plane to prepare for takeoff, but then he gave it full throttle. I didn't even have my seatbelt or headset on yet. I'm focusing on getting this stuff on when I realize something isn't right. Getting closer to the end of the strip, Captain starts to panic as we aren't getting airborne. His hands were shaking like mad and he kept reaching for things but he couldn't figure out what was wrong. I think he was too busy looking at the trees and creek right ahead of us. I realized the problem. He was in such a rush to leave that he didn't do a pre-takeoff check. Propeller was still in full course, feathered on shutdown. It should have been full fine for takeoff. I gestured to him the problem and immediately pushed the prop forward. Engine had a huge surge and we just barely cleared the trees at the end of the strip. He acted like nothing happened for the rest of the flight. We didn't even speak a single word to each other. I suspect none of the passengers even realized what had happened and how close we were to being another statistic. When we got back to the airport I told him I was leaving, packed my bags and never looked back.